The harbor breathed like a living creature under the winter night, its lungs full of coal smoke and cold Atlantic air. Gas lamps drew Orioles on wet cobblestones as a steamship slid into New York, ropes slapping the piers with the sound of stubborn applause. On the foredeck, veiled and tall, Isabela moved like a rumor in white fox and midnight silk. She was 25, in her absolute prime, a face that painters would plead to immortalize. Eyes dark as tea at 4 o'clock, hair pinned with discreet mother-of-pearl, a posture that seemed to carry both the room and the century. The city's gossip writers had named her the Winter Queen of the New World the day she arrived. Their headlines would change by morning. The warning started as a misfire, just a spark near a crate, inconsequential the way fate often is at first. Then the crate coughed flame, and the flame found a ribbon of oil. The pier lifted itself an inch and dropped. Men shouted. The night turned quicksilver with panic. Isabela did not run. A sailor pulled her by the elbow just as a panel of burning slats fell where she'd been standing. Embers hissed on the wet planks, sketching an omen. When the smoke cleared, they found a thin copper wire and a clockwork device with its gears chewed by fire. It would be called an accident in the morning editions. A constable lifted a charred scrap of paper with tongs, the fragment of a telegram, letters fused in soot. Only 3 characters remained legible. 8. By the time the carriage navigated the Bowery and the elevated rail rattled overhead like a steel insect, the whisper had begun. A British insult, a hidden hand, a queen in danger. Isabela cradled the half-burned telegram in her muff and watched droplets race each other down the window. In reflection, she saw not fear, but hunger, the urge to know. Her staff begged for the Waldorf Astoria. She insisted on a smaller townhouse off Madison Square, close enough to feel the city's pulse. On the mantel, she placed a hair locket she wore for luck, Victorian and delicate. A tiny braid coiled into gold filigree, a reminder that love and mourning share a drawer in society's bureau. Across the ocean, another queen's name anchored headlines and hearts. Elizabeth, 29, magnificent. In certain portraits, her gaze could slice lace. Here in America, her emissaries prepared an itinerary of charity and spectacles, a visit to the Boston Athenaeum, a tour of Philadelphia's factories, an appearance at a Chicago gala where electricity would paint the night anew. Already the public compared the two women like rival operas. The theater of it delighted some and rattled others who measured history in consequence rather than applause. In a room perfumed by cedar and sealed envelopes, a different audience formed. He wore a city-cut coat that hid his breadth and rings that flashed when gaslight grazed them. His beard, red gold and precisely kept, turned the amber of whiskey when he leaned into the light. He called himself many names, Mr. Headley, Mr. Herrick, Mr. Northam, but his closest confederates, men who owed him favors or feared his ledger, addressed him simply as the eighth man. He had the gift of yesterday's kings, the certainty that the world existed to submit. He had, too, the modern man's instruments, private telegraph lines, Pinkerton men in his pocket, and shares arranged like troops. On the desk before him lay a map of two queens moving on American rails. He did not admire them. He admired the friction between them. "Sir," said a clerk, "the message went as requested." He slid a carbon copy across the desk. It was a diplomatic venom, a rumor pressed flat into dots and dashes, then launched at midnight through a web of copper and will. "A necessary insult," the eighth man murmured. "No war is born without a whisper." In Boston, the winter sang under carriage wheels, and the Beacon Hill windows glowed with the kind of candlelight that made reputations look honest. Isabela attended a charity tea hosted by Mrs. Julia Ward Howe. Etiquette hung over the room like a chandelier. Men spoke of railroads and women spoke of husbands who spoke of railroads. Susan B. Anthony stood straight-backed near the parlor ficus, a storm contained in black silk. She took Isabela's hand, and for a breath the room forgot to breathe. "Your enemies prefer you docile," Anthony said, plain as a legal notice. "Let them dislike you properly." Isabela smiled, sensing an ally rather than a sermon. The conversation was cut by a servant carrying a silver salver, a telegram wrapped in ribbon. The message was clipped and cold, claiming Elizabeth had questioned Isabela's legitimacy in a private Boston drawing room, that the words were overheard by a baron's widow with no need to lie. A lie dressed for the opera, Isabela dismissed the room. Alone, she stood by the mirror. She had trained her face to be a kind of stage, show what needed showing, hide what would be used against her. She unfolded the telegram again. 8 stared back at her. Not ink this time, but pressed into the paper like an embossed threat. Her fingers weren't trembling, though a small part of her wanted to. Luto, she thought. Mourning, but not for a life lost, for the courtesy now poisoned. The next evening after a reception at the Omni Parker house, a wheel came loose on Isabela's carriage at the exact moment it passed a narrow bridge. The driver swore later he'd checked the bolts and found them museum-tight. A boy selling papers saw a man bend near the axle just before the Queen stepped into the carriage. The boy described him. Heavy shoulders, fine gloves, the glint of a signet ring. The carriage's axle-tree snapped like a wishbone. Isabela fell forward, a rush of cold air and street lamp, the smell of horse sweat and brass. Hands caught her, hands that smelled of ink and cigar ash. Frederick Douglass himself, tall as a lighthouse and calm as one. He had been leaving a meeting of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society and had paused by fate's theatrical instinct near the roadway. "Careful, Your Majesty," he said in a tone that dignified her without theatrics. "They will not try you in court if they can try you in the street." Later, in a quieter parlor, he told her what power fears. Not a rival, but a conversation between rivals. "Talk to the woman," he said. "Let the crowds call it vanity. Let history call it courage." The next telegram arrived in Philadelphia, while bells mourned and celebrated the same century. The city smelled of coal and bread, and in the knitting mills the rhythm of the looms resembled an army marching toward an invisible border. Isabela visited an ironworks with Andrew Carnegie and listened to a speech about philanthropy delivered in a Scottish burr that sounded like granite. In his office, between engravings of steam hammers, he produced another telegram, forwarded from a Baltimore station. This one suggesting that Elizabeth's emissaries had spoken to Pinkerton men about leverage. Who wrote it? What was its source? The threads were too neat. Isabela traced with a gloved finger an indentation at the bottom of the page, a crescent like a hangnail, the same tiny scar she'd seen on the first message. 8 again, not written but marked, as if the sender added fingerprints. That night she dreamed of Elizabeth. Not as an enemy, but as a figure on a train platform, coat hem whipping in a winter wind, eyes clear as law. The train did not arrive. The platform emptied until only the 2 of them remained, and from the telegraph office came the nervous clatter of a language both of them understood and neither of them trusted. Chicago received her like a brass band. The Columbian Exposition's bones still loomed on the lakefront, ghostly white palaces and an idea of the future. Steam curled from manholes and turned the streets into a painter's study of gray. She rode the Ferris wheel with a small entourage, a gesture the papers called democratic and the matrons called reckless. Mid-rotation, the wheel shuddered and stopped. Far below, a man in a derby hat lifted his face and watched with the expression of a theater critic observing a tragedy he'd ordered. He had the beard of the eighth man, trimmed within a whisper of engineering. Isabela's carriage swayed. She refused to look afraid. Beside her, a child, daughter of a Polish seamstress, clutched a peppermint she'd been offered and whispered, "Do queens get scared?" Isabela replied honestly, "Only when there is something worth saving." When the wheel groaned back to life and the gondolas descended, she accepted a bouquet tied with a crimson rope. The rope held a card. No ink, only a blind stamp pressed into the cardstock. 8. She handed the bouquet to a woman whose smile was all courage and little luck. At the foot of the midway, a poster offered P.T. Barnum's grand finale in a Chicago theater. Electrifying illusions under gaslight. The poster's corner bore a faint mark like a Roman notch. 8. She would have gone to Elizabeth that night if geography were a shorter creature. Instead, she sent a letter by the quickest, most private route she knew. A schoolteacher's brother from Baltimore, who knew the inside staircases of every Western Union office along the route. A man who'd avoided jail because he could outrun steam. "Deliver to Elizabeth's own hand," she instructed. "No desks, no aides, no silver trays." She sealed the envelope with wax and a simple crest, a rose and a storm cloud, before handing it to the sprinter. "Tell her," Isabela added, softening, "that I am not her enemy. Tell her, no, don't tell. Make sure she reads my words." The letter landed in New York ahead of Isabela, because fear travels faster than trains. Elizabeth read it in a private room. The wallpaper a determinate blue that said money and taste without shouting either. She was everything the papers said and more. Beauty tempered by discipline. Humor used as a blade when company deserved a cut. She read the letter twice. Her gloved fingers left a pressure on the paper she could feel in her bones. She rang for her lady-in-waiting and spoke only this: "Find me a place where one can see the city and not be seen by it." Meanwhile, the eighth man set his final arrangements. He would try again on the rails. Steel forgives less than water. The train east from Chicago was a procession of ambition. Bankers polishing cufflinks, actors rehearsing without moving their lips, traveling preachers who smiled like gamblers, and Isabela in a private car with red velvet seats and a gramophone that sounded like someone remembering a song. In the night, the train slowed in a patch of farmland cut by river and fence. A signal lantern swung on the left when it should have swung on the right. The engineer eased the brakes, and a figure in the ditch touched a match to a fuse. Isabela rose from her seat at the first unnatural stutter of the wheels. The explosion wasn't grand, it was precise. The second car jumped the rail and whispered sideways into a snowbank, doors vomiting people, luggage spilling like organs from a suitcase. There was blood, yes, but more fright than fatality. The Victorian world excelled at suffering without spectacle. Isabela, fur thrown over nightdress, hair unfastened, waded into snow, lifting children, ordering the frightened into ranks like a general who'd learned from grief. A man in a peaked cap watched from the far fence, smoke a black feather in the cold. He lifted 2 fingers as if to bless or count, then walked into the dark winter as if it had invited him. By morning, the papers called it sabotage. By afternoon, an accident. Some suggested, just suggested, that a rival court might have expressed itself through American rails. The whisper war had a taste now. metallic and intimate. In New York, Elizabeth read and folded and unfolded newsprint the way a woman folds the letter of a lover not yet trusted. The meeting place proved easy to choose and hard to reach. The Brooklyn Bridge, midnight, fog. The walkway offered height without shelter, a place of perspectives. Gas lamps along the cables burned their sad gold, and the East River bristled with ice. Isabela arrived first in a cloak the color of wine and dusk. Behind her, a woman in a plain hat walked as if she had no shadow, the Pinkerton detective assigned by a woman who insisted her name not be printed. Clara Benton, she had introduced herself. Quiet eyes, fast feet. She stopped halfway up the approach and took up a place with her back to the railing, a glove near the pistol she swore she would not need. Elizabeth came without fanfare, 2 steps before her footman, the hem of her cobalt velvet riding the boards like a proper scandal. The 2 women faced each other between cables that had held the weight of a city's belief. They did not bow. They inclined their heads the way winter does when it's deciding to continue. "Your letter said urgent," Elizabeth said, voice winter clear. "The papers say I sneer." Tell me which is true and which is theater. Isabela had prepared lines, then burned them in her mind. "They want our conversation to be a performance," she answered. "I prefer a verdict." She took a breath that tasted of river iron. "I am not your enemy. I have never sought your humiliation, and your alleged remark about my crown, if I took every invented quote personally, I would be a museum of insults." Elizabeth's gaze tested for weakness, found only fatigue draped in courage. "You write cleanly," she said. "You stand like a woman who has practiced not falling." Then, almost softly, "Do you know who's doing this?" "A man who likes to be counted," Isabela said. "The 8th man. He measures power in lines on a map and strokes of a bell. 8 of them, perhaps. He believes we are decorations, not decisions. He is wrong, but he is dangerous first." Elizabeth's chin lifted like the tip of a rapier. "Then why risk coming to me alone?" "Because I needed you to hear my fear in my voice," Isabela said. Ink strips words of breath. "You must see me and know. I don't fear you. I fear him, and you think I do not see that?" Elizabeth's composure frayed a thread. "My own car nearly overturned in Philadelphia. The harness was cut to appear worn. My guards found a playing card tucked under the driver's seat. The 8 of swords." "Then he underestimates neither of us," Isabela said. "He wants our eyes on each other so we do not look up to see his hand." A gust sliced their conversation, and both women turned as a lane of fog opened above the water. Down on a barge, men shouted. On the Manhattan side, a piano in some boarding house bled scales into the night. The bridge settled into its great patience. In that lull, truth had space to stand. "I have tried to imagine your downfall," Elizabeth admitted, then smiled at her own cruelty. "It did not satisfy me. But your death would satisfy someone. That's an appetite that should alarm us both." She stepped closer, conspirator to conspirator. "What do you propose?" "An ugly alliance," Isabela said. "Ugly because it will cost us vanity. We must speak to the same people and let them see we do not bite. We must walk the same rooms and make every hostess choose not between us, but for both of us. And we must reveal the man who plays with wires like God with weather." "Names," Elizabeth said. "Always names." "His aliases are a wardrobe," Isabela replied. "The 8th man when unobserved, Mr. Northam at the Exchange, Headley in a club on 5th Avenue where the brandy is older than sin, Herrick to a man named Morgan, Henry to those he wishes to alarm." "Henry," as in an ancient ghost who loved power more than he loved anything living. She watched the knowledge hit Elizabeth like a cold wave. Yes, Isabela added. Henry VIII, or someone content to wear his shadow. History does not repeat, Elizabeth said, but men do. She extended a hand. For now then. Until the wires are quiet, they clasped hands, leather glove to kid glove. And for an instant, both queens looked tired enough to be mortal and stubborn enough to be legend. Beneath them, the river shouldered ice toward the harbor and the future. The alliance could not simply be spoken. It had to be staged in society's theater. The next evening, by arrangement both delicate and bold, Isabela and Elizabeth entered Delmonico's together. The restaurant was a silk-lined sermon on money. Mirrors made the company double, and chandeliers birthed illusions. Men on the margins found reasons to approach and failed. Women nearby smiled with their mouths and calculated with their eyes. Isabela and Elizabeth took a single table under a potted palm and ordered identical courses. They spoke of charity, art, and the weather, subjects proper enough to disarm, and then allowed the room to overhear what mattered. You asked for proof, Isabela said, in a tone cultivated to be barely overheard by 3 tables, which in New York meant it would reach 30 by morning. She slid across a wrapped parcel, a telegraph key engraved with a small concealed sigil 8. From a Western Union office in Baltimore, she said to the air, not to Elizabeth. Found by a girl who cleans after closing and knows which things do not belong to dust. The girl in question, crouched in the kitchen hallway in a borrowed dress, clutched at her own courage. Her name was Agnes, and she would tell this story to her granddaughter until the granddaughter believed she had been there too. Across town in a cavernous lab on South Fifth Avenue, a soft-spoken man adjusted coils that hummed with the sound of bees. Nikola Tesla, lank and strangely luminous, had been invited into the conspiracy. Not because he enjoyed company, he did not, but because he understood the heartbeat of copper. Someone has piggybacked a private signal, he told Clara Benton, the Pinkerton with the quiet eyes, while they stood between delicate machines that looked as if they'd been designed by a choir. A cadence of 8. The pauses are the signature. He tapped a rhythm on the workbench. Short, 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 short. Then the same again. If you can get me one of the devices used to send, I can tune to his whisper. Clara had another asset, one the 8th man had not calculated. Nellie Bly, a journalist with a hatpin and no patience for men who confused women with curtains. You want an exposé? Bly drawled, blue eyes busy. I want a story with a pulse. She smiled without warmth. Let's give the city a lesson in arithmetic. The trap was a ballet of brass. A decoy telegram would be sent from a suite at the Waldorf. The message an irresistible morsel. The time and place of a supposed private accord between the queens, with an implication of weakness. Elizabeth conceding a point. Isabela granting a privilege. If the 8th man saw a chance to accelerate the fracture, he would take it. Tesla would be listening for the cadence. Clara's people would be listening for footsteps. P.T. Barnum, offended by amateur illusions, offered a theater as the stage for the finale. Let him bring his drama to a place built for it, Barnum said, and I'll sell tickets to his comeuppance. He smiled with showman's mercy. Proceeds to charity, of course. But the 8th man did not step into the trap, like a drunk into a joke. He sent men whom he owed little and liked less. They moved through the theater like moths behaving badly, cutting ropes and planting a powder charge to bring down a scaffold at the precise second 2 queens were to be seen on the same balcony. He sat across the street, an opera cloak folded at his side, a cigar nested between fingers that wore history. He had never believed the women would meet in truth. Men who worship themselves find women's courage implausible. When the queens actually did appear, side by side under the theater's golden proscenium, some unused muscle near his heart did something like surprise. The scaffold never fell. Tesla's cadence sang from a borrowed transmitter, and the powder charge expired in a whisper of smoke for the stagehands to curse at dawn. In the wings, Barnum's men, offended professionals, escorted 2 saboteurs into the alley and let them consider the night. Inside the box, Isabela and Elizabeth stood close enough for the city to decide the word friend would not scorch either of them. Their dialogue was nothing. Praise for a singer, a remark about acoustics. The room did not hear the content. It heard the choice to speak. Still, the 8th man had one more move, an older move than telegraphs. A knife. He did not carry it himself, but a man he'd paid, American by birth, illiterate by opportunity, approached the Queen's carriage as they left through the private entrance on 33rd Street. The blade flashed the way Gaslight makes any metal seem gentler than it is. Clara's glove moved faster. The knife skated across her sleeve, cut only fabric, and clanged against the carriage step. The assailant stared like a man waking to the wrong morning. "Who told you?" he asked the air, as if the air had betrayed him. The 8th man retreated, digesting failure the way a lion digests difficulty. It made him hungrier. He took refuge in a private office loaned by a banker whose name could buy a war. J.P. Morgan's people would later deny any knowledge. Morgan himself was in a different room speaking about pearls and progress. On the 8th man's desk lay the evidence of a century. Maps, bonds, a route through the sewers of influence. He dialed a telephone, another invention that made whispers travel faster, and prepared a final directive. On the far side of the door, a man coughed. On the near side, a woman's voice said, "You prefer men to do your cutting, Henry." How like you, Isabela and Elizabeth stepped into the room as if they owned it. They did not, but they owned what it might cost them to be there. Clara took position at the door, pistol unholstered but lowered. The 8th man did a small thing first. He rose. Court training, his own or borrowed, insisted. "You dress your enmity well," he told them. "Together, you make a picture worth printing." His smile had teeth and arithmetic. "But pictures fade," Elizabeth answered first. "So does infamy when it's properly lit." She gestured to the window where Gaslight painted the glass with patient stars. "You've used the newest wires to conduct the oldest crime?" "Division is not a crime," he said mildly. "It is the method by which men choose winners and admit themselves the game." He looked at Isabela with the curiosity of a botanist regarding a flower he cannot name because it refuses to be trapped in a book. "You should be enemies. The world enjoys symmetry. 8 points on a compass, 2 thrones, 1 war. You deny the world its geometry." Isabela stepped closer until she could smell his cologne, an old-fashioned mix of leather and something that wanted to be citrus and failed. "You signed your work with 8, she said. "You wanted to be seen even while hiding." "A man should know his number," he said pleasantly. "Some numbers manifest destiny." He tilted his head, allowing the portrait of arrogance to be perfectly composed. "A pity you will not live long enough to correct the rumors." The knife he'd planned to use that night never left his desk. Clara had removed it when she entered. Still, he had plans for rooms within rooms. A fuse hissed unnoticed in the hall, set earlier to ruin this precise set of people. The queen saw it as the eighth man glanced past their shoulders. In that glance lay his confession. Elizabeth moved first, palm against Isabella's shoulder, a push that felt like a betrayal and proved to be a gift. The small explosion that followed was not the crescendo he wanted. It was the comma their story required. Smoke, a shower of plaster, a scream from a clerk, and the instant afterward when death took a breath and reconsidered. He ran. Of course he ran. Down staircases that smelled of ledger ink and varnish, through a lobby made of marble and corner deals, into a street whose lamps flickered in the wind's bad mood. The women followed. Their skirts did not drag. They conducted them like commanders ignore weather. In the street, the eighth man turned toward the elevated rail. A train rattled above like a thought refusing to be silenced. He climbed the iron stairs two at a time, a figure of vigor and ugly grace, and reached the platform. There, a small crowd had gathered to watch their own city perform as itself. Queens and smoke and pursuit. He turned, perhaps to bow or to aim, and found a ring of faces, poor, curious, unafraid. The boy from Boston, now in New York by the kind of migration poverty arranges, called out, "That's him." The seamstress's child held tight to her mother and whispered, "He looks like a picture that doesn't like you." Men who'd never met agreed without speaking. They understood that a man could be defeated by witnesses. The eighth man smiled again and saw his reflection in the train's window like a ghost auditioning. He measured the distance to the tracks. He measured his pride, which was larger. Clara appeared at the top step with her pistol raised in a sentence that had not yet found its punctuation. "Alive," Isabela said behind her, her breath making a sainthood of the cold air. "Alive if we can." Elizabeth stood at her side like a second clause that makes a sentence inevitable. The eighth man's hand, ringed and sure, moved toward his pocket. The platform held its breath. Then a different hand, a dock worker's, scarred by rope and day, closed on his sleeve. "No more," the man said simply, setting down the century's arrogance with the century's strength. He did not fall to his death. That would have been tidy. He was shackled, not by queens, but by citizens. To a post until the police arrived. Breath visible, eyes seething. He would be arraigned and defended and written about. He would speak in court about commerce and coincidences, and the papers would devote entire columns to his profile. Men like him always find defenders in men who hope to be like him. But the wires went quiet. Tesla's machine heard only ordinary traffic. Love notes disguised as inventories, bad poetry, coded jokes. The cadence of 8 faded into the night like a story the city refused to repeat. Still, victory resisted any theater's bows. Rumors cost reputations, and reputations, when bruised, do not heal without a limp. Elizabeth faced a chorus of advisors whose voices were so polite, they sounded like knives wrapped in velvet. "You endangered the dignity of your station," they said. "You dignified gossip with your presence." She listened and then said dryly, "The difference between gossip and history is who writes it." She chose to publish her visitations to American hospitals and schools, a ledger of kindness that does not require applause. Yet a corner of the public, trained to prefer feuds to reforms, missed the old show. Isabela paid differently. A faction within her circle, humiliated to have been outmaneuvered by a man whose appetite was so public, demanded a sacrifice to satisfy the century's love of tidiness. She offered herself, not in body, but in emblem. For 6 months, she wore mourning black in public, not for a person, but for trust. She commissioned a small brooch of jet and gold, a tiny 8 broken into 2 4s, and pinned it near her collarbone, where observant eyes could ask and be answered. "I'm in mourning for a number," she told a curious duchess. "I'm in mourning for the shortness of arithmetic when applied to people." The gesture became a museum piece for a decade, then a footnote for a century, then an image on a schoolroom wall that made children ask good questions. In San Francisco, the fog applauded the Pacific with both hands, and Isabela walked Market Street with a shawl around her shoulders, breathing the spice of Chinatown and the brine of ships pointed everywhere. She visited a photographer who specialized in post-mortem portraits, Victorian and tender. The living posed with their dead in a quiet insistence that grief belongs to the family album. "Photographs teach the living to hold still," the man said, "and the dead to be seen." She thought of the night on the bridge, the way truth had needed stillness. In Charleston, both queens attended a concert in a hall where the plaster peeled like old wallpaper prayers. A soprano sang a hymn and broke her own heart on the high note. The audience cried gracefully. Behind the stage, an old woman handed Isabela a small package, the telegraph key with 8, now transformed into a paperweight by a blacksmith's mercy. "For your desk," the woman said, "to keep your papers from flying." Isabela accepted. "I was a maid in the Western Union office," the woman added, smiling with sly pride. "Agnes was my friend. Baltimore gave them crab cakes and opinions. Philadelphia gave them a reminder that factories are made of people before steel. Chicago, after, offered electricity like secular prayer. New York watched and judged and, against character, learned. In a vaudeville theater, a comedian told a joke about queens who liked each other. The audience laughed as if they had always believed it. Outside, 2 men argued about stocks while a girl read an article by Nellie Bly that refused to be vague. She wrote about wires and smoke and the arithmetic of men who mistake 8 for infinity. Her closing line, almost pretty, declared, "A whisper can be louder than a shout if you put it in the right room." Months later, in a small salon hung with violet drapes, Isabela and Elizabeth met one last time before the ocean reclaimed them. No ceremony, no witnesses except Clara Benton, who had learned how to be present as furniture and far more useful. The queens drank tea with lemon and no sugar. They spoke of weather and then, inevitably, of consequence. "We saved more than ourselves," Elizabeth said, not as pride but as report. "We saved our people from a war that would have made our names powerful and ugly." "I wanted an easier victory," Isabela confessed. "Something that didn't ask for penance. But stories that end too cleanly are lies we tell to children." She touched the jet brooch at her collar. "I will remove this when I no longer need the reminder." Elizabeth smiled the way people do when they have decided to be remembered precisely. "Do you know what I keep?" she asked. From her reticule, she produced a tiny object wrapped in tissue, a lock of hair braided into a ring, mourning jewelry, modest and fierce. "From a nurse who lost a boy at Bellevue. She gave it to me because I listened." She slid it back into her bag as if permission were a ritual. "That is what I will write under the portrait of this year. I listened." They stood, and the room seemed pleased. Elizabeth took Isabela's hands again. "We will be compared," she said, smiling. "We already are. Let them compare our stubbornness." "Let them compare our refusal," Isabela replied, "to be reduced to 8. The final twist was not a knife, but a letter. Months after the trial that made the 8th man a legend of the wrong kind, a package arrived at Isabela's temporary residence in Baltimore. Inside, a ledger bound in brown leather and a note in a hand that knew calligraphy as a weapon. The ledger cataloged payments, names, and, chillingly, requests placed years earlier to smear, to tilt, to nearly break. Among the names, a banker, a newspaperman, a countess with excellent posture, lay one that quieted the room. A distant cousin, blood of Isabela's blood, who had been paid to genuine up a rumor with a well-timed sigh. Betrayal did not surprise Isabela. What did was the second page, a list of people who had refused. Agnes, the boy who sold papers, the dock worker with rope scars, a nurse, a seamstress's child. The eighth man had made his own enemies by underestimating the people who would not be bought. Isabela mailed a copy of the ledger to Elizabeth with a note only 2 sentences long. History is as heavy as we allow it to be. I suggest we distribute the weight. Elizabeth's reply came with a pressed violet. Weight carried together, she wrote, teaches the back to become a spine. Years would sift rumor from report. The 2 queens would be sketched, painted, argued over, and finally taught in classrooms where children discovered that the Victorian age, so fond of surfaces, held women who dared to be structural. The gas lamps would give way to bulbs, the elevated rail to tunnels, telegrams to telephones, to voices in pockets. But somewhere in New York, a locket of hair would still sit in a drawer, and somewhere in Chicago, a girl would point to a picture of 2 women on a balcony and say, "They made the city change its mind." If you close your eyes, you can still see 3 pictures, bright as a theater poster. A crimson cloak and a cobalt velvet gown facing each other in a halo of gaslight atop the Brooklyn Bridge. A telegram key stamped 8 beside a rose wax seal. The copper wire coiled like a serpent around a truth too strong to strangle. A Ferris wheel stalled against an iron sky, a child's peppermint clenched in a small fist, and a man with a red-gold beard watching his future spin away. When we tell this story, let us remember what the century tried to forget. That a whisper war can be ended not by volume, but by compassion sharpened to an edge, and that courage, when properly lit, does not flatter or threaten, it simply clarifies. If this story lingers with you, if the fog on that bridge still smells of iron and winter, if the thrum of a telegraph hums somewhere near your ribs, carry it forward. Share it, argue with it, tell it at a kitchen table under a modern light, because the old wires are gone, but new ones are always being strung, and we decide what travels along them next.